The year 1066 is widely known as one of the most important and pivotal time periods in English history. This year in particular often juts out above the rest for being the time in which Duke William of Normandy set sail with an army to invade England and claim the throne from King Harold Godwinson, in which the two men fought at the well-known Battle of Hastings. On the 14th of October of that year, the Kingdom of England would witness one of the most radical and forceful changes to its society, as following the defeat of the English king, the Duke of Normandy would go on to conquer the entire country and be crowned as the new monarch on the 25th of December 1066. However, the story of 1066 goes far beyond just the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest, as this year would actually witness the end of two major eras of European history. The first being the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule over England, and the second the violent conclusion to the Viking Age, which took place just weeks before William of Normandy and Harold Godwinson fought at Hastings. In September of 1066, merely 2 weeks before William's landing on the south coast of England, a massive fleet of the Norwegian army led by their king Harald Hardrada would set sail across the North Sea and land on the northern English shores to begin their own invasion. What followed was a series of bloody battles that would set the tone of the countrywide violence to come over the crucial following weeks. Today's video will aim to provide a background to the tumultuous events that led to Harald Hardrada's invasion of England and the subsequent crisis of power that unfolded. This is the story of the three-sided fight for England's crown between the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Normans. To begin the tale on the 1066 crisis, we must first look at the closing weeks of the previous year. Towards the end of 1065, the ruling King of England, Edward the Confessor, began to fall ill. A man in his early 60s, Edward had been on the throne since the year 1042 and had overseen a generally peaceful time during his reign without any major military battles or conflicts under his name. Notably, Edward had fathered no children at the time of his death on the 5th of January 1066, and thus with his passing had inadvertently plunged England into a succession crisis. This issue forced the interjection of the Witan, which was the King's Council containing many high-ranking ealdormen, bishops and thanes from across Anglo-Saxon England. The outcome of Edward dying childless meant that there were four principal figures who could arguably lay some type of claim to the English crown. The first of those, and the one with the strongest claimant, was a teenager by the name of Edgar the Atheling. Edgar the Atheling was only around 13 or 14 years old at the time of Edward the Confessor's death in early 1066, and was ultimately ruled out by the Witan for the kingship due to his young age. However, having been a direct descendant of Alfred the Great and the last male heir from the House of Wessex, Edgar did have the strongest claim to the throne in terms of his lineage, and no doubt had he been just a few years older and had proven himself as a worthy military leader, he would have become the new king. The second claimant was a Norwegian king by the name of Harald Sigurdsson, who was nicknamed Harald Hardrada, or Harald Hard Ruler in English. Hardrada had been on the throne of Norway since the year 1042, and unlike Edgar the Atheling, was known and feared throughout Europe as a formidable and powerful ruler. Despite being a man in his 50s, Hardrada had a wealth of military experience behind him, having fought battles since the age of 15, when he fought alongside his half-brother Olaf Haraldsson at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 to reclaim territory lost to the infamous King Canute of Denmark. Hardrada's experience had also made him a well-travelled and worldly man for his day, as losing the battle in 1030 forced the young Harold into exile to eventually end up in the service of the Varangian Guards of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. Once in the service of Yaroslav, Harold's career with the Varangian Guards, an elite unit of the Byzantine army, saw him take part in battles across southeastern Europe, Asia Minor and deep into Arab lands, as well as the Baltics, Russia and Eastern Europe. After many years, Harald Hardrada would eventually make his way back to Norway, becoming a co-leader alongside Magnus the Good in the year 1042, and later the sole king of Norway after Magnus's death in 1046. By the time of 1066, Harold believed his claim to the throne stemmed from an agreement between Magnus the Good and King Harthacnut, who was the son of Canute, in which the throne of England would be passed on to Magnus should Harthacnut die without an heir. Whilst this did indeed happen, the death of Magnus in 1046 meant that Harold believed he would inherit this oath, despite there being no legally binding clause for a successor of the agreement. Overall, whilst Harold's claim was very weak, his fearsome reputation as a tough ruler and battle-hardened Viking meant his words were certainly not to be downplayed. The third claimant to the throne was a nobleman known as Harold Godwinson, the second-born son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex. From the 1020s until his death in 1053, Godwin was regarded as one of the most powerful earls in England, possessing vast amounts of political influence and sway over the Witan Council. Being the eldest of his surviving children in 1053, Harold became Earl of Wessex and thus took control over the majority of southern England. Yet unlike his father, who sought to undermine and ever increase his power against King Edward the Confessor, Harold kept close ties to Edward and maintained a loyalty to him during his time as Earl. It is said that on his deathbed, Edward entrusted the kingdom to Harold as the next ruler in the view of witnesses and followers, but there is some debate on the historical accuracy to this. The political dynamics of the time also helped further bolster Harold's claim to the throne, as part of the reason Edward the Confessor is sometimes regarded as an unpopular ruler was due to his failure opposing increasing Norman influence within English politics, as 19th century historian Edward Augustus Freeman hypothesised. It was ultimately decided by the Witan that Harold would become the new king after Edward's death, and proceeded to take the throne on the 6th of January 1066. The final of the four major claimants to discuss in the build-up to the 1066 crisis was a Norman duke by the name of William, the illegitimate son of powerful lord Robert of Normandy, also known as Robert the Magnificent. Like the two Harolds, William too had a wealth of military experience to his name. Having been the bastard son of Robert of Normandy meant William often struggled with affairs of legitimacy. In 1035, at only the age of 7, William was nominated as the heir to Robert and accepted as a Norman duke under the title William I of Normandy, following his father's death on his return journey from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. William's time as duke didn't come easy, as due to his young age and lack of good counsel, the duchy began to fracture into rivaling factions led by power-hungry nobles vying for control. However, during this tumultuous period, his mother, Helena of Falaise, did manage to protect William from harm's way. In the year 1047, William's leadership and military skills were put to a major test after he led an army of Normans against a coalition of rebels to fight for control of the duchy, where he was supported by King Henry I of France. This victory, as well as numerous others, solidified William's stance as a formidable fighter and excellent military tactician in the field of battle. The source of William's claim is believed to have stemmed from a meeting between himself and Harold Godwinson in 1064, as well as one earlier in 1051 with Edward the Confessor himself, in which the Duke of Normandy claims that both Harold and Edward had promised the crown to him in the event of Edward dying without an heir. William was also a cousin of Edward through the lineage of the King of England's mother, Emma of Normandy, who had been married twice to two previous English kings, Ethelred the Unready and Canute in the early 11th century. Thus, these various factors of lineage and promises idealised to William that he had a strong claim of hereditary rights to the throne. It is also worth mentioning a fifth important figure involved in this succession crisis in the form of a man who was the younger brother of Harold Godwinson. The brother by the name of Tostig Godwinson was the Earl of Northumbria during the events leading up to 1066 and had been overthrown by a rebellion in the Northern Realm a year prior in 1065. Tostig had been a very unpopular leader in Northumbria, having ruled with an iron fist and taxing the inhabitants unjustly and to a crippling level. The result of the rebellion forced Tostig into exile, and with his own brother and King Edward taking part in negotiations with the rebel factions, Tostig saw this as a huge betrayal and plotted revenge. Whilst Tostig had no claim to the throne itself, his time in exile landed him firstly in the court of Baldwin V, the Count of Flanders, and later is believed to have sought an unsuccessful alliance with William of Normandy. The Count of Flanders, however, provided Tostig with a fleet of ships, and thus the first major moves in the 1066 crisis would start to take place. And so, with the crowning of Harold Godwinson on the 6th of January 1066, both Harold Hardrada in Norway and William of Normandy, upon hearing the news, were left infuriated by the decision, and the two kings set about their own preparations for an invasion of England. In the spring of 1066, Tostig Godwinson would be the first to strike by launching a series of raids along the coast of Kent, particularly around the area of Sandwich. However, he was forced to retreat after King Harold dispatched land and naval forces to see off the raiders. After these events, Tostig continued to raid along the coast before he fled firstly to Scotland, where he was harboured in the court of King Malcolm III, and later during the summer continued on to Norway to join with Harold Hardrada. With Hardrada reeling in anger from his snubbed claim to the throne earlier in the year, and Tostig's feeling of betrayal from his own brother after the Northern rebellions, the two men devised a plan to build up a large fleet of Norse soldiers to invade the British Isles later in the year. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Normandy, Duke William was also conjuring up a plot to launch his own invasion of England. Shortly after the crowning of King Harold, William sought a meeting with his nobles and supporters with the aim to build up a general consensus for a planned invasion. Norman historian William of Poitiers also wrote how the Duke of Normandy sought the consent of Pope Alexander II sometime in the first half of 1066, and after little deliberation, both the Pope and William's nobles ultimately supported the Duke in his planned conquest of England, with a target date set for the summer of 1066. Back in England, Harold Godwinson was well aware of the imminent threats from the Norwegian and Norman leaders, and thus had his armies and naval forces dispatched around the country to intercept any incoming overseas vessels. It is believed that Harold saw William as the main threat due to the proximity of Normandy and England being so close to one another, and from news that William had obtained the consent for his invasion from the highest authority of the Catholic Church. In preparation for the Norman army, Harold had the bulk of his troops stationed along the southern coast of England and the Isle of Wight in the summer of 1066. However, throughout the month of August and early September, unfavourable and abnormally strong winds for the time of year repeatedly delayed William's chances to cross the English Channel, with both Harold's army and the Duke of Normandy's essentially locked into a standoff for many weeks. As summer turned to autumn, both Harold and William were now feeling the pressure, as their respective armies, while on standby, would still need to be provisioned and enough of a fighting fit state for the outbreak of war. With the arrival of harvest season and the lack of any movement from William, King Harold ultimately decided to stand down the majority of his troops on the 8th of September. However, before the King of England had barely any time to plan his next moves, Godwinson received word that the Norwegian king Harold Hardrada and his brother Tostig had sailed into the mouth of the Humber and were making their way towards York. The Viking force, consisting of between 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers and more than 200 longships, is thought to have landed initially at Tynemouth and raided local villages and towns for supplies, before landing later at Rickle in modern-day Yorkshire on the 20th of September. With Harold Godwinson and the bulk of the English army still in the south of England, the defence against Hardrada's and Tostig's combined army would fall into the hands of Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. On the 20th of September 1066, an army comprising of around 6,000 Mercians and Northumbrians set up a defensive position between the River Ouse on their right and boggy marshland on the left, near the town of Fulford on the outskirts of York. King Harold Hardrada approached the joint Earl's army from the south and lined up his own troops along the riverbank, with his least experienced troops on the right and his best soldiers on the left. The opening of this battle between the Northern English army and the Norwegians saw the Anglo-Saxon defenders strike first by unleashing a charge towards Hardrada's men before they could fully deploy. The Norwegians were pushed back into marshlands and for now were forced onto the back foot against Morcar's troops. However, this initial success for the Anglo-Saxons wouldn't last, as with the arrival of Norwegian troops, Hardrada was able to begin his counter-moves. The Viking leader firstly ordered more troops from the right flank to attack the centre and sent more of his men into the river. Despite them being outnumbered, the invading troops through force and might managed to push the defending English army back. Through this manoeuvre, Hardrada has succeeded in splitting the English forces, as Edwin's army, who were positioned between the River Ouse and a small beck, were now cut off from the Mercian allies. With more and more Norwegian troops being deployed into the battle, the Anglo-Saxon army was forced to retreat and fall back onto York, following an eventful crushing defeat to Hardrada and Tostig's forces. Whilst Edwin and Morcar had survived the battle and fled with the remnants of the English troops, the failure on their part of the Northern English army would ultimately force the intervention of Harold Godwinson, who would raise an army in the south of England and march north to confront Harold Hardrada. After the Norwegian victory at Fulford, the combined Hardrada and Tostig army marched towards York to consolidate their power in the north. Before their arrival, news was sent that the city was prepared to surrender under the agreement that no looting or destruction would take place, to which Harold Hardrada agreed. As official negotiations between the city of York and the Norwegian king were being scheduled, Hardrada and Tostig established a temporary base camp near the village of Stamford Bridge, a few miles outside of York. But, unbeknown to Hardrada, word of Earl Edwin and Morcar's defeat had quickly reached the ears of Harold Godwinson, and with a massive English army at his disposal, the King of England was rapidly advancing towards York. On the 25th of September 1066, Harold Godwinson, King of England, and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, would come face to face in what would be the first major clash between two of the three kings in this tumultuous succession crisis. According to Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, before the battle a lone figure approached Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson. The figure reportedly spoke to Tostig and promised him his earldom in the north of England if he were to betray Hardrada and abandon the oncoming battle. In response, Tostig asked the figure what Harold would be willing to offer the Norwegian king for his troubles, to which the figure replied 6 feet of English ground or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than most men, implying that Harold Hardrada would lie dead and his army would be slaughtered. According to this legend, the mysterious cloaked figure who had approached Tostig and threatened the Norwegian king with death was none other than Harold Godwinson himself in disguise. As the Battle of Stamford Bridge began, the English army launched a surprise attack on the Norwegians, who were caught off guard by the speed of Godwinson's response after the English defeat at Fulford and the sudden appearance of a massive army on the horizon. The English attack was delayed at the onset by a choke point caused by the bridge from which the battle owes its namesake. According to legend, a lone Viking warrior stood on the bridge blocking the way forward as English soldiers funneled into his path. The warrior stood his ground, reportedly cutting down 40 Englishmen alone before finally being slain by a spear from a gap in the wooden bridge. Once the English poured across the bridge, they then faced a Norwegian shield wall, to which they would stop just short of this before locking together in a tight wall themselves and charging forward. The battle would rage on for hours, with many hundreds of English and Norwegians being cut to pieces in this bloody fight for the crown. As time wore on, it was becoming clearer that the English persistence began to break Hardrada's lines, and slowly but surely placed the Norwegians on the back foot. As the lines were being broken away further and further, an English archer sighting the enraged Viking king in the midst of battle would fire a single arrow that would put an end to the Norwegian campaign. Unaware of the archer, the legendary warrior Harold Hardrada was struck in the throat by the arrow, putting an end to his life in a battlefield far from his homeland. Tostig Godwinson too was also slain in the fighting, as was another important Norse nobleman. The deaths of these 3 men saw the Norse lines break completely, and the English put an end to the Viking campaign barely a few weeks before it had begun. Despite his victory, however, Harold Godwinson's problems were still far from over, as barely a day after the Viking defeat at Stamford Bridge, the King of England received news that Duke William of Normandy had finally found favourable weather conditions for his fleet and had crossed the English Channel. With most of the English forces in Yorkshire, Godwinson would immediately have to march the bulk of his tired and withered army over 200 miles back to the south of England to confront the invading Normans. The stage was now set for the final battle for the English throne, and in just a matter of weeks, the country that had already seen so much bloodshed would witness its most famous and legendary battle of all time.